Hi guys, my name is Alexandra Weimer, and this is my presentation for the Child Development and Family Studies 415, Family Interaction and Communication. This is my genogram, activity number 6, on the family from the movie Encanto, the Madrigal family. The peer review article I chose focuses on trauma and dysfunction within generations of families. I think this is very good for this project because this family does exhibit that in many ways, and I'll explain that throughout. The three concepts I chose to focus on for my peer reviewed article really focus on the dysfunction in families and how much of an effect it has on you. Not only is it affecting your mind and your mental state, but it can also affect you emotionally and physically, even. I think a lot of mental disorders do start to transcend into a physical aspect, and it can be debilitating and affecting your everyday life. So I think that dysfunction definitely passes through generations without a doubt, especially if it's unresolved dysfunction or trauma. So I think that that is the main thing that I wanted to focus on. And also, I wanted to focus on how it's transmitted to children, and a lot of times through adverse childhood experiences. I think many people can relate to that in this world, especially within the last 5 or 6 years with the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been a lot of adverse childhood experiences for a lot of kids, and that can have a deep effect on them. And it does go with you through adulthood. It doesn't just stop, especially when it's not dealt with. Like I said, not dealing with things just continues them even if you don't feel it every day. A lot of these people that they covered in this study are adults that have been affected by people who are substance abuse people, or who have people who have been incarcerated in their family and things of that nature. That's the main group that they focus on within this study. And those are inherently adverse childhood experiences. I think the COVID-19 is a really relatable and just general thing that we can speak about or understand when it comes to an adverse childhood experience. Also, there isn't usually just one adverse childhood experience that makes it something that transcends past just short term. In the long term, people who have had multiple of these experiences are the ones who tend to suffer more from them. So when they have 2, 3, 4, who knows how many, is when you start to see the effect just build up and build up. And you can see a lot of information done on this, rather than just the one experience and how it might affect them. Not saying it doesn't affect those people, but it's just not as likely to be something that's carried on through the years. Like I stated in my first slide, I think that dysfunction and trauma are multi generational things, especially when they're unresolved. I think that's the biggest key to this whole thing, is that unresolved things don't ever just go away. They just are kind of pushed to the wayward until they come to the forefront again and demand to be felt or experienced or dealt with. Dysfunction stems from traumatic things. In this scenario, the traumatic things really start with death, the loss of her home, and then the need to keep up this perfect persona, like there's no issues, when in reality we live in a world, even if this is a fictional world, that is with fault, and we aren't perfect, and there's no way to be perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. There's going to be things we don't do the right way, or whatever it may be. We are with fault, and you can't keep that perfect persona going on forever. And I also want to step into the adverse childhood experience area. She had triplets, and even though that they were young when all those things happened, they still now are growing up without a father, are growing up in a home, even though they may not have known their original home very well. They are not experiencing things the same as normal children. And they are also now, as they get older, they get given their gifts. 3 different things: clairvoyance, healing, and control of the weather. And these are things that any kid not sure how they would deal with it. So they are experiencing things in other ways than normal kids would be. My example from this movie is really just focusing on Mirabelle. She tends to be our main character that we follow throughout this whole movie, and that she is different from everyone else in her family. We know that she didn't receive a gift like everybody else did. She had a ceremony, but when she touched the door, nothing happened. And that automatically made her completely different from everybody else, and maybe put some blame on her that there's something wrong with her and there's a reason she didn't receive a gift, even though we don't know that reason. So I think that altered a lot of things for her as we follow her throughout her childhood, and maybe some resentment from Abuela because she isn't like all of her other grandchildren or children. She's different. She's normal, but not the normal that everybody else wants. The main difference that I found as when comparing the movie Encanto and the article I chose was that none of the dysfunction in the Madrigal family really stemmed from substance abuse and incarceration and things like that. Rather, it was the unresolved trauma that was passed down. The main similarity I found was the adverse childhood experience. I think that it is a good name for what was going on in this family and what really started the issues with Mirabelle and Bruno and all these different family members. I think that the triplets never had a normal childhood, nor did Mirabelle and her siblings and her cousins. They were forced to be these extraordinary human beings when in reality they probably just wanted to be like everybody else. As for my insights, I really don't think that there was a name that I could give the dysfunction that Mirabelle was experiencing, because it kind of seemed as simple as like Abuela favoriting the other siblings or her cousins over her because they were once again given these extraordinary gifts and she wasn't. There was a reason that she wasn't given this gift, and it made her less than. And she wasn't able to help this community like the other people I mentioned. She was forced to just be normal like the other community members. And I think that people really looked down on her for that rather than just treating her like a normal human being. I think the biggest takeaway I have from this assignment and when it comes to the family dynamics is that we are unfortunately a lot of times a product of our environment. Many people in this world experience adverse childhood experiences, trauma, dysfunction in their family, or just in relationships in general. So I think that it has a large effect on who we become as human beings. And a lot of that is if we deal with things, if we just let it go and don't really address it at the time, and then unfortunately probably it's going to come to the forefront again at some point throughout our lives. So we can break the cycle or we can let the cycle continue, and I think that's a personal choice you have to make. As for the movie, I think that Abuela started the cycle and it's just continued with her children and her grandchildren. And I think that there's two people that it really has had more effect on than anybody. And I think Bruno, her son, and then her granddaughter Mirabelle have really suffered the consequences of her trauma and her dysfunction more than anybody else. Bruno was isolated because he wasn't doing things that people really liked. He was giving them these visions that people didn't agree with, and it's just something he saw. He had no control over it. And then Mirabelle, unfortunately, suffered the consequences of not getting a gift, and that made her automatically different from everybody else, and it made, I think, her abuela resent her in some way. I chose the attribution theory for this portion of the project. The terms I used were internal attributions, attribution error, and blaming. All these things can be correlated back to the movie Encanto in different forms. For internal attributions are something we attribute to like personal factors or behaviors. For an example, when Casita was cracking and the family was losing their powers, Mirabelle blamed herself because she was unsure of what was causing it. Bruno had a vision and it looked like she could have possibly been the cause of that. Cycle I wanted to look at was avoidance, and the conflict I really chose to focus on was the conflict between Mirabelle and Abuela, and how they really truly never dealt with the conflict between them, which was Abuela had some type of resentment towards Mirabel because she didn't get a gift, and then felt like it showed a weakness in the family, and there truly was a breakdown of their relationship. And I think it just continued on for years and years. It didn't really stop until the end of the movie, because when Mirabella was supposed to receive her gift, she was young, and at the end of the movie, obviously, she was a teenager or early 20s. So they didn't get their conflict resolved until they were willing to talk to each other and have an honest conversation about what happened and the fact that Mirabelle wasn't to blame for anything that happened. She could have stopped it, and they both could have stopped it if they would have just had this conversation sooner, it seemed like. Because when she was willing to make up with Isabella, you could tell that the cracking had receded within Casita. In this slide, we just continue the cycle of the avoidance conflict cycle between Mirabel and Abuela, and eventually getting to the resolution of them finally having a conversation and coming together as a family, and knowing that family is truly what mattered most in this whole situation. It never was the gifts, because as long as they had each other, that was most important more than anything. Lastly, the topic that I chose for this portion of the project was family stress. I think that this is something that transcended through this whole movie, with some sort of stress on somebody, depending on if it had to do with their gift or not with their gift, or losing Casita and the Encanto and all that. So the terms I chose were coping, supportive communication, and adaptation. And you can see below all the things I highlighted in this, and the examples that I pulled from the movie.